Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the various aspects of the 3D, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at Alita Battle Angel, the Robert Rodriguez film from 2019. This was co-written and co-produced by James Cameron, who was of course responsible for the most famous 3D film of them all. But prior to Alita, Rodriguez had actually shot more movies in 3D than Cameron, who whilst he's post-converted a couple of his earlier films and made 3D documentaries, Avatar is actually the only film that he's made in 3D as of the time of Alita's release. So for its maker's combined 3D experience, this one clearly came along with high expectations, particularly since it was filmed with 3D cameras, something that was incredibly rare by the end of the decade. But I guess that seeing as James Cameron had spent something like 7 years designing and developing his own 3D camera system, any 3D project that he's involved with is going to shoot natively. And whilst the live action was shot natively, the film's title character is obviously digital, along with lots of other characters, which I assume would have been rendered in native 3D rather than being post-converted, although I'm not actually sure. Unlike Avatar and Titanic, this film hasn't been reformatted to 1.78:1 for the 3D Blu-ray release, so this is presented in its originally composed shape of 2.39:1. I think some people were disappointed that this release didn't include any scenes that opened up into full screen as per its IMAX version, although I'm personally extremely pleased that it doesn't do that, as I'm sure is everyone else who projects onto a 2.39:1 fixed frame screen at home. I suppose it's no surprise that the film's style of 3D is very similar to Avatar's. That's to say that it's mostly very natural 3D with something of an aversion to hyperstereo, and this means that all of the longer shots of things in the distance, like landscapes, cityscapes, are usually as good as flat and consequently of no interest from a 3D point of view. They've designed a great looking film here, so for me it's just a bit of a shame that none of the cityscapes have any real sense of 3D about them. This is clearly a creative decision, and it's one that they've obviously given thought to and decided is what's best for the film, but I couldn't help feeling just a little bit disappointed that we don't get any of these great vistas in a perceptible amount of 3D. There were times when, during these long shots, there was something in the foreground, like you've got the clouds here in front of the city in the sky, or the characters here being on top of the closest building that's sufficiently close to the camera to give the 3D something to do. And there was one shot that looked like it had an interaxial quite a bit wider than they used the rest of the time, so there is some depth and separation in between these skyscrapers. So since they were prepared to go a little bit hyper here, it's a pity that they didn't do that a bit more often, I think. Whilst a lack of hyperstereo shots might not bother too many people, something that I think would be a bit more of a letdown would be if the film also had an aversion to pop-out shots. Unfortunately, there are a few of these, but on the whole, it's the space behind the plane of the screen that's used far more effectively than the space in front of it. By way of example, if you look at this shot of Christoph Waltz handing an orange to Alita, the orange is about at the level of the screen, and his arm stretches back beyond the screen. It's perfectly effective 3D, and if his arm had emerged from the screen with the orange placed somewhere in negative parallax, I think that there's no doubt that this shot would have looked cheesy and a bit ridiculous. So it's an indication here that the 3D is tasteful rather than gimmicky. All is not lost though if you like some pop-out moments. There are some, most of them featuring this character's long springy chain fingers which emerge from the screen quite a few times, mostly though just for a few frames, but in this moment, which is in slow motion, I think it's the film's most overtly flashy use of 3D. Some of the other pops include these blades reaching out towards us, and a shattered window briefly blasting shards of glass out of the screen, and there's a door here that's been smashed in where at least a few fragments of the wood break out of the screen. You've got these sparks here which are quite a nice effect, but generally it's one of those films that takes its 3D pretty seriously, in as much as it keeps it natural and behind the screen most of the time. There are a few parts of the film like a bit of a 3D tease, like we see this sword several times, but not once in the type of 3D shot that you might expect. Or there's this blowtorch, which in this shot you probably assume is popping right out of the screen. It's basically just the flame and maybe the very front of the torch that's in negative parallax, so only a very minor bit of pop, and even then only incredibly briefly before the shot fades to white. Actually, that blowtorch is also an example of one of the film's minor negatives, in that the first time we see it, which is this shot, it's flat. That's to say, it's 100% two-dimensional, and it's not the only time this happens in the film. There are several scenes which contain shots in 2D, and I'm not talking about those effectively flat cityscapes, but actual 2D shots in the middle of an otherwise functioning 3D scene. These are odd, and I think definitely shouldn't happen. Maybe in this one, the lens flare that you can see here was only in one lens, so that would have ruined the shot from a 3D point of view, but if that was the case, why not just post-convert it, which is something I'm sure they had the budget to cover for a few seconds here and there. The worst of these 2D shots is this moment. It's early on in the film where Alita is playing a street version of the motorball game that we see later on in the film, and in this moment she scores a goal, or whatever it's called in this roller skate game, and it's an important dramatic moment because it's revealing something significant about her character, but for some reason this shot is in 2D. And I know that to some people, when a 3D film throws in a 2D shot, it's as jarring and nasty as, say, a multi-channel soundtrack suddenly going into mono. And I can't believe there's any creative reason for these 2D shots, so it does just come across as a little bit sloppy. There's another key dramatic moment which, whilst it's not in 2D, it has very weak 3D, and it's one of those moments where the music is used very clearly to let us know that it is a dramatic moment, but the 3D completely fails to complement that in any way, which is a bit of a shame. In Avatar, James Cameron often used strong 3D at dramatic points, which I think was very effective, but I only really thought that this film managed to do that on one occasion, which is when Alita marches through these doors at an important moment. And this shot is a top-down view, something that very often works particularly well in 3D, and it's not the only one in the film. This is another top-down view that has a really nice sense of 3D. It feels really strong and powerful, and better than that is this view. This, I think, is my favourite 3D shot in the whole film. The ground looks like it's a long way beyond the screen, and the antenna thing that he's holding onto on the right pokes a good way out of the screen. And best of all, the shot is held for long enough to fully appreciate it. It's a really standout moment and a great piece of 3D. I was impressed at the way this avoided one of the often seen problems in natively shot 3D films, which is where you get reflection conflicts, with a noticeably different amount of light coming off objects in the left and right eye views, which can look very odd and off-putting. Whilst Alita's shiny black hair was exactly the kind of thing that can cause this problem, that would have been CG rendered, so it's not going to be an issue. The only time I did notice it was on the wound on Christoph Waltz's shoulder here, and whenever this happens it tends to immediately draw attention to itself, so it's good that it was kept under control in this film. The story here takes place, I think it was 500 years in the future, and the screens that we see, for the most part, don't really look any better than what you've been able to buy in your local electronics store for the last 10 years or so, although thankfully there are a few screens, like the one we see in the background here, whose displays are fully three-dimensional or holographic even. So hopefully this would mean that any of the cinemas in this world will maybe be able to show 3D films without people having to complain about wearing 3D glasses, which is one of the factors that has helped to crush, I think, every attempt to popularise 3D over the years, including this most recent era, which I suspect will end up as having seen Alita as being amongst the final few films to have been shot in native 3D. In terms of composition, it does feel like a lot of thought and effort was put into framing this for effective 3D, and I'd say that nearly all of the shots look like they've been framed with 3D in mind. Sometimes in quite an obvious way, like here where there are things dangling down in front of the actors, or putting the view behind these bars. It's maybe not subtle, but I think it's quite nice. A bit less obviously, but still effective, are shots like this, where the footboard of Alita's bed gives the shot something to do with 3D space, or placing her behind the banisters on the staircase here. It does feel like there's almost always something in the frame that's on a clearly different plane to the main subject, like the very first time we see Christoph Waltz. He's emerging from behind this pile of stuff. It looks like they've definitely kept in mind that they're making a 3D film and not just shooting a normal film but with 3D cameras, which is sometimes the case. Something that's done with most of the dialogue scenes is that they're usually over-the-shoulder shots. Maybe it's shooting the film in 2.39:1 that allowed this to happen a bit more naturally, and I think that compared to 2019's one other native 3D 3D film Gemini Man, which was shot in 1.85:1 and often had just the person doing the talking in the frame, making for very dull 3D. Doing what they do here, having both people in the frame like this, does go some way to keeping the sense of 3D alive, even if it's not a very interesting 3D shot. There is the odd moment here and there where we see just one person with a shallow depth of field, but when it's Jennifer Connelly alone in the frame, I'm not going to get too upset about the lack of good 3D composition. It's worth mentioning, though, that this is one of those 3D films where people's faces mostly look quite flat. Like the first time we see Alita, her face is disappointingly lacking in much of the way of solidity, although it's good to see that in this moment, which is one where the drama is dialed up, the 3D is dialed up also, so there's plenty of depth and three-dimensional shape to her face here. Having done a great job with 3D when he was right amongst the vegetation of the Pandoran jungle in Avatar, I think James Cameron was well aware of how good trees and leaves can look in native 3D. And I wonder if that's why there was one scene where we see Alita and friends in amongst some trees. Unfortunately, though, they don't really exploit this environment from a 3D point of view, so this scene wasn't maybe as good as it could have been. And on the subject of times when the 3D wasn't as good as I think it could have been, it did feel to me like it was at its weakest during the motorpool sequences. These were all composed of fast-moving action, and I didn't think the 3D was ever very inspiring here. The composition during these sequences often looked good for 3D, like this shot here, but the 3D just looked strangely weak, and that weakness was really shown up, I thought, when on various occasions during the motorball action we cut to crowd shots when the 3D was clearly much stronger and more effective. And the worst bit in a motorball session, from the point of view of wanting better 3D, was this moment where the players jumped through two walls of fireworks, and being a long shot, this is virtually flat, so fair enough, but I was waiting for a view from one side of the firework curtain, with it maybe filling the screen, 3D space full of sparks, as somebody burst out of it towards us, but we never got that view, so it really felt like a bit of a wasted opportunity to me. Overall, I would class this as having good solid 3D for the most part, and other than those depthless cityscape views and a handful of flat shots, it was always very apparent that it was in 3D. On the other hand, maybe apart from that rooftop view down to ground level, I was never dazzled by the 3D here, so I didn't really think there were any particularly spectacular 3D shots. Very quick word on the film itself. I quite liked it. I thought it looked great and it set up an interesting enough future world, even if it did feel a little bit like we've seen most of the elements here, both visually and thematically, in various other films. I thought Alita herself was one of the most believable CG characters I've seen so far, and Rosa Salazar performed the role really well. I know that some people were a bit worried about those massive eyes, but I actually thought they looked so good and right that I got to the point that every time it cut to a human, I started to think that our piggy little eyes look far too small and unexpressive in comparison. I wasn't a fan of all of the performances though, and I thought that in particular Ed Skrine's Cyborg was a bit too full of an irritatingly overdone, arrogant swagger. The film maybe strayed into young adult territory a little bit, which I could almost always do without, and a lot of the extras were dressed in clothes that looked like they just wandered in off the street. I mean, it's fine that they're not wearing Baker foil jumpsuits, but their clothes look distinctly early 21st century to me. Maybe one of the film's biggest problems was that it probably set itself up to be the first in a series of films, so perhaps it didn't have as satisfying a conclusion as I'd have liked, but I'm not sure if it was popular enough for a follow-up film to be made, but if one is, I'll certainly look forward to watching it. I'd definitely recommend this for your 3D Blu-ray collection, even though in this case it does mean you'll have to pay a little bit over the odds, because it's only available as a disc within the 4K Blu-ray package. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.